Hey everybody, this is Decorators in Python. So, what's Decorators in Python? Say you have a function. For example, we have a sum task function here that does some arbitrary work, and we want to time this function. We want to know how long is this function taking to execute. Now, say this could be a network request or a database query execution, and I can always use the time module to time this using, I can just time the function before I start execution. I can just time the, I can just store the time before I start the execution. And post my execution, I can check the current time and actually check the difference to compute the difference or compute the time taken to run the function. Now, although this seems like an easy solution, but there is a slight problem. Say you have a couple more functions. So if I have three more functions, let's say I'd simply have to do this, which is I've got four functions here. I've got A, B, C, and D. And all I'd have to do is actually time it before I run the function. After I run the function, and just print the difference. Now, although this seems like an easy solution, if you look at the code, this looks kind of bad. And this is where decorators come and make life a lot easier. So let's try and write a decorator that times our function. So if you look at the code here, what we've written here is actually a decorator. Now I want you to focus on this part. So we have a function that says timer, which is the name of our decorator, and takes some arbitrary function. So we don't care what function that we want to time. It just takes some name. So we've given func or func here, and I want you to forget about this. All this function does is returns a wrapper. So if we now look in a wrapper, right? So all the timer function does, it takes in any arbitrary function and returns some other function that's defined inside. Now, what does that function do? It takes in any number of arguments. It takes in any number of positional and keyword arguments, times the function before we run the arbitrary function that we took first in the timer function, stores the result in RE, gets the time after running it, prints the time taken, actually return the return value. Now, what we've done here is written a generic timer function that can be used to time any function. Now, say we have this function called fetch data, maybe that does some network request, and all we have to do now is kind of set this as, hey, I want to call the fetch data function as the argument to the timer function. So if you think about this, we have this timer function which takes in any number of arguments. In our case, it's the fetch data function, and it returns the wrapper function. So essentially, fetch data function is basically equal to the wrapper function. And what does the wrapper function do? It takes in any number of arguments and then kind of injects this timing code, which is before and after and printing, into our function. So we don't have to kind of do this manually any more time. We just have to kind of call our fetch data function as a argument to the timer function. Now, if you think about this, so this is what we just did now. And if you think about this, at timer, this you might have seen this if you've done some Django or Flask or Fast API code, where you might have, for example, you might see at app.route, or maybe see something like at login required in Django. It's kind of this, it's just syntactic sugar for what we've written here. Instead of calling the timer function and passing the fetch data function to kind of time it, we can just say the places where we define a function, for example, here at def fetch data, we just have to say at timer, and it intrinsically just adds that functionality into this. So let's try and code this from scratch. So let me just bring my terminal. So what I'll do is open the dec.py file, which is, I've got an empty Python file here, and I know that we need the time module. So I'm going to say from time import time, and say we have a function called fetch data. So I'm going to write this function here, and to simulate some work, let's just put some amount of sleep here. So I'm going to say sleep, and let's select a random amount of seconds. So I'm going to say from random import random, and we'll say delay equals to rand end of, let's say, 1 to 3 seconds. Well, let's just say 1 to 5. And so it'll select some random time between 1 and 5, and we'll sleep for that many amount of seconds here. So we'll say sleep of delay, and that's all a function does. Now, if I want to time this function, just like we showed in the presentation, we can do before equals time, and say call our function here, and we'll just say after equals time, and we can say print, let's say time taken is after minus before, and that kind of does our jobs. If I run this, name delay is not defined, delay equals rand end sleep of delay. What did happen here? Unused variable delay. Let's see that delay. Oh, go a typo here. So if you look at this, we've got delay. I'll just change this here, and this should work now. So got C Python 3 dec.py, and just sleeps for X number of seconds and just says, okay, this is the time that it took to run the function. And this kind of works, but say we had a couple more functions. So let's say instead of fetch or maybe fetch data, we had maybe run query, and we had to time this too, right? We'd have to do the exact same thing here. I call the function before and then get the after time. And then let's say instead of time taken for this would be just, we'll just print this right above so we can see this, and we would have the same line here, and I can call this, and this kind of feels intuitive, right? This works. So we slept for first second, 1 second in the first function, and then 4 seconds, and that's it. But move on to the decorator solution. So I've got this, let's say decorator, and we'll just write a function. So we know we want to call a decorator timer. So I'm going to call this, and we know we'll pass some arbitrary amount of function, some arbitrary function into our timer function. And this kind of returns some internal representation of our passed function, which is wrapper, right? And what's wrapper? It's just a function that injects our logic into this. So we have arguments and keyword arguments, so that the function that we pass should be able to kind of take any arguments. And we'll just have the same logic here, before equals time, and we run our actual function. So I'm going to say func of star args and quags, and take the after time and print the time taken after minus before, just like we did earlier. And we print this, and I can just say return the return value of our actual function that we wanted to time, and that kind of solves our problem, right? And instead of doing all of this, right, I can either say, when I call this, I can say fetch data equals to timer of the function that we want to do. So here we have fetch data equals fetch data, and so if I call fetch data now, it should give us the same implementation that we had earlier. So def wrapper, let's see. So we have, okay, so it's not wrapper, it's return wrapper. There you go. Let's say turn Python 3 dec.py. And so it took 5 seconds. And instead of doing this, I know that I want to time the fetch data function. I can just do this now and just call the function that I would do like before, right? It doesn't matter, and I do not have to reassign this to the timer function stuff, and this should pretty much return the same result. I'll just try that. I think it took 5 seconds. There you go, it took 5 seconds now. And I can always do the same with the run query function, so that we do not have to kind of mess our library user code. We just have to kind of modify our user code here, and there you go. I can call both the functions here, and I'll print here. Let's say print, let's say fetching data, and we'll do executing db query, right? And we make sure that both of them are happening in there, and we're fetching the data. It took 2 seconds, and for executing the db query, it took 4 seconds. And so this is pretty much it. With just one wrapper function here, which is one simple addition logic, we're now able to time any function we want with just one additional line of code. That's all from my side. Thank you so much for watching.